Listen closely, because what I'm about to reveal exposes one of the most carefully hidden fears of contemporary existence: the terror of being alone, not just physically isolated, but stripped of all external validation, all social mirrors, all the constant noise that drowns out the one voice you're most afraid to hear, your own. Rudolf Steiner, peering into the depths of human consciousness with that unsettling clairvoyant precision, identified this fear of solitude as one of the primary mechanisms keeping humanity trapped in collective unconsciousness, a defense so powerful that billions of people organize their entire lives around avoiding even brief moments of genuine aloneness. This isn't about extroversion versus introversion. This is about something far more profound and disturbing: the recognition that modern human beings are so fragmented, so alienated from their own essential nature, that being alone with themselves feels not just uncomfortable, but existentially threatening, like a death they must avoid at all costs. The neuroscience of social connection reveals how deeply embedded this fear is in human biology. Research by John Cacioppo on loneliness shows that perceived social isolation activates the same threat response as physical pain or danger, triggering cortisol release, inflammation, even impacting immune function. Studies using brain imaging show that social rejection activates the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex and anterior insula, regions that process physical pain, explaining why loneliness hurts so viscerally. Research on social media addiction by researchers like Jean Twenge demonstrates escalating rates of anxiety and depression correlating with increased digital connection, suggesting that constant superficial contact actually intensifies rather than alleviates the underlying terror of aloneness. Studies on sensory deprivation and isolation show that within hours, most people begin experiencing disorientation, hallucinations, desperate need for stimulation, revealing how dependent consciousness has become on external input to maintain sense of self. But Steiner's analysis penetrates beyond neurobiology into spiritual dimensions that explain why this particular historical moment produces such acute fear of solitude. In previous eras, he taught human consciousness was more naturally embedded in spiritual realities. People experienced themselves as connected to invisible worlds, to ancestors, to divine presences, so physical aloneness didn't mean existential isolation. But the modern consciousness, what he called the consciousness soul era, has progressively severed those connections in order to develop individual autonomy and rational thinking. The price of this development is profound sense of cosmic loneliness, being cut off from spiritual dimensions, experiencing yourself as isolated ego in mechanistic universe. Without conscious spiritual development to reconnect at higher level, modern humans are left with only other humans as buffer against the void, creating desperate codependency where aloneness feels like annihilation because you've lost connection to your own eternal essence. Watch for these signs of the fear operating in yourself and others, because they're ubiquitous in contemporary culture. You reach for your phone the instant you're alone, filling every gap with scrolling, messages, videos, any stimulation that prevents actual solitude. You keep relationships going long past their expiration date because ending them means facing yourself without the other's reflection. You overwork, overschedule, overfill your life because stopping means confronting what emerges in empty space. You feel anxiety rising when plans fall through and you're left alone for an evening. That creeping dread that something's wrong, that you're deficient, that aloneness is failure. You notice how restaurants and public spaces are filled with people desperately avoiding eye contact. Everyone's staring at screens, creating bubbles of pseudo-connection that prevent genuine encounter with themselves or others. You observe how dating has become frantic consumption, people treating others as entertainment devices to ward off the terror of Saturday night alone. The progression of how this fear develops and intensifies follows stages Steiner outlined with prophetic accuracy. In childhood, natural play and imagination provide companionship even in physical solitude. Children can be alone without being lonely because they're connected to inner worlds. But socialization and education systematically train this capacity out, teaching that value comes from external achievement and social approval. By adolescence, peer belonging becomes desperate need, identity formation happening entirely through reflected appraisals, the self constructed from others' opinions. In early adulthood, romantic relationships and career become primary vehicles for avoiding existential solitude, giving life meaning and structure that prevents confronting fundamental questions. By middle age, many people have so thoroughly externalized their sense of self that genuine solitude produces crisis, retirement or divorce or empty nest, revealing that they have no idea who they are without their roles and relationships. In old age, isolation often intensifies while capacity to reach out diminishes, leaving many elderly people trapped in loneliness they have no tools to navigate. And this collective fear creates society organized around distraction, constant stimulation, perpetual connection that never actually connects, producing what Steiner called ahrimanic consciousness. mechanical, externalized, cut off from depth and meaning. The entire economic system profits from this fear, selling products, experiences, services that promise to eliminate aloneness while actually intensifying the underlying terror. Social media platforms are designed to be addictive precisely because they tap into fear of missing out, fear of being alone, fear of irrelevance. Entertainment industry produces endless content so you never have to be alone with your thoughts. Self-help culture often reinforces the problem, treating solitude as deficiency to be overcome rather than capacity to be developed. Even spiritual communities can become just another form of avoiding genuine encounter with yourself, using group belonging to bypass the necessary work that only happens in solitude. The protocol for beginning to work with this fear, rather than being controlled by it, starts with honest recognition. First, track how much time you actually spend in genuine solitude, without screens, without other people, without distractions, just alone with yourself. Most people will be shocked to realize it's almost zero. Second, start small, commit to 5 minutes daily of sitting alone, doing nothing. No phone, no book, no activity, just being present with yourself. Notice what arises, the anxiety, the restlessness, the desperate urge to escape. Third, investigate the fear directly, asking, what am I afraid will happen if I'm truly alone? What am I avoiding? What might emerge in the silence? Fourth, begin distinguishing between loneliness, which is a painful state of feeling disconnected, and solitude, which is chosen aloneness that can be nourishing and generative. Fifth, recognize that fear of solitude is actually fear of meeting yourself, and that this meeting, while potentially uncomfortable, is necessary for genuine development. We arrive at Steiner's devastating diagnosis, that the fear of solitude is not personal failing, but is symptom of profound spiritual crisis, the death of old forms of connection to divine without yet developing new conscious relationship, leaving modern humans suspended in unprecedented isolation, terrified of the very aloneness that could become doorway to discovering what they actually are beneath all the social conditioning and external validation. This isn't just about being more comfortable alone. It's about recognizing that your fear of solitude is actually fear of freedom, fear of sovereignty, fear of the terrible responsibility of being an individual consciousness in a universe that doesn't provide ready-made meaning or purpose. Until you can face yourself in silence, until you can bear your own company without distraction or escape, you remain enslaved to external circumstances, dependent on others for sense of self, incapable of the autonomous spiritual development that is the actual purpose of this incarnation in this particular historical moment. The fear of solitude is the prison, and recognizing it is the first crack in the wall, the beginning of discovering that what you've been running from your entire life is actually what you've been seeking all along, the encounter with your own eternal essence, waiting patiently in the silence for you to finally stop running and come home. Now we descend into the mechanism of how the fear operates, the way the false self, the constructed personality, the ego identity you call me, is actually dependent on constant social mirroring to maintain its existence, and how this dependency keeps you trapped in sleep, unable to wake up to your true nature, precisely because that nature only reveals itself in absence of the audience your false self requires. Steiner taught that what most people call I is not actually the eternal spiritual self, but is rather a construct built from internalized voices, social expectations, memories, and conditioning, a character you've been performing so long you've forgotten its performance. And this character, this false self, is terrified of solitude because without an audience, without social feedback, without constant reinforcement from others, it begins to dissolve, to reveal itself as the fiction it always was. Your fear of being alone is actually the false self's fear of its own non-existence. The social psychology research on self-concept validates this understanding from different angle. Studies on the looking glass self by sociologists like Charles Cooley show that identity forms primarily through perceived reflections from others, that you literally see yourself through eyes of those around you. Research on social comparison by Leon Festinger demonstrates that people constantly evaluate themselves relative to others, using social feedback to determine worth, ability, and even emotional states. Studies on audience effects show that people's behavior, performance, even physiological responses change when being observed versus alone, revealing that the self-aware self is fundamentally social construction. Experiments on solitary confinement show that extended isolation without social contact produces psychological deterioration, not just loneliness, but actual fragmentation of sense of self, suggesting identity requires social scaffolding to remain stable. But here's what mainstream psychology doesn't acknowledge, and what Steiner penetrated with clairvoyant perception. This socially constructed self, while necessary stage in development, is not your true nature, is actually obstacle to awakening that must eventually be transcended. The Buddhist teaching of Anatman, no self, points to same recognition. That the self you think you are doesn't actually exist as solid entity, but is process, flow of conditioned patterns, mistaken for permanent identity. The Hindu Vedantic teaching that Atman, true self, is beyond ego, beyond personality, beyond anything social, recognizes that what you essentially are cannot be found in mirror of others' perceptions, but only in direct awareness, prior to all social construction. Steiner's distinction between personality and individuality, between the temporal ego and the eternal I, maps exactly this territory. Personality needs others to exist. Individuality exists, whether others are present or not. The signs that your sense of self is parasitically dependent on social validation are everywhere in your experience, if you look honestly. You change how you present yourself depending on who's watching, becoming a different person with different audiences, which reveals there's no stable core, just adaptive performances. You feel anxious or empty when alone for extended time, as if you're starting to disappear without others to reflect you back to yourself. You compulsively check social media not for information, but for validation, for evidence that you exist, that you matter, that someone notices you. You make decisions based on what others will think rather than what you actually want or value, living life designed to maintain approval rather than express authentic desire. You feel diminished or elevated by others' opinions, your mood and self-worth fluctuating based on external feedback rather than arising from stable internal source. You notice that much of your mental activity is imaginary conversations, rehearsing what you'll say, replaying what you said, constantly relating to internalized others even when physically alone. The stages by which false self develops its dependency on others follow a predictable pattern that begins in childhood. Initially, the infant has no clear self-other boundary, exists in state of merged consciousness with caregiver. Then around 18 months, the I emerges. The child recognizes itself in mirror, says no, begins asserting separate will. But this emerging self immediately becomes conditioned by need for parental approval, learning to perform in ways that gain love and avoid rejection. Through school years, peer acceptance becomes crucial, identity forming through reflected appraisals, internalizing how others see you. In adolescence, this reaches peak intensity, the self almost completely constructed from social feedback, peer opinion mattering more than any internal knowing. In adulthood, if healthy development continues, gradual individuation should occur, sense of self becoming less dependent on external validation. But for most people, this never happens. They remain trapped in an adolescent pattern of requiring audience, and when social mirrors are suddenly removed through loss, rejection, or isolation, crisis occurs because the self can't maintain itself without its props. And this dependency creates profound suffering that masquerades as normal, creating what Steiner called the collective sleep, where everyone is performing for everyone else, no one actually present. Entire social world becoming hall of mirrors reflecting nothing but reflections. You waste enormous energy maintaining images, managing impressions, calculating effects, all of which is exhausting and hollow. You never develop capacity to self-validate, to determine your own worth, to access inner authority, remaining perpetually vulnerable to others' judgments and manipulations. You're vulnerable to any ideology, cult, or charismatic leader offering to tell you who you are because you have no stable self-knowledge against which to test their claims. You remain trapped in codependent relationships where losing the other feels like losing yourself, because it literally is. Your sense of self is so entangled with theirs that separation feels like death. You never discover your actual desires, values, or purpose, because you've spent entire life performing others' expectations, rather than exploring your own depths. The protocol for beginning to withdraw energy from false self's need for audience requires systematic practice in solitude combined with ruthless self-observation. First, take regular time completely alone, starting with hours, working up to days if possible, with explicit intention to notice how you function without social input. Second, observe how much of your thinking is actually internal dialogue with imagined others, and practice interrupting that pattern, coming back to direct experience of being here now without the narrative. Third, stop posting on social media for a defined period, 30 days or more, and observe the withdrawal symptoms, the anxiety, the need to share, revealing how dependent your sense of existence has become on digital validation. Fourth, practice making small decisions without consulting anyone, without considering what others would think, just acting from your own preference or intuition, building muscle of self-trust. Fifth, work with self-inquiry questions like, who am I without others defining me? Who would I be if no one was watching? Exploring in journal or meditation. We arrive at liberating and terrifying recognition that most of what you call me is not actually you, but is construction maintained by constant social reinforcement, and that in absence of that reinforcement, the constructed self begins to dissolve. which feels like dying but is actually the beginning of discovering what you are beneath the construction. This is why solitude is so threatening to false self, why it will generate intense anxiety, compelling stories about why you need to reconnect with others, why it cannot survive extended isolation, because it literally cannot exist without the social matrix that created and maintains it. But your true nature, what Steiner called the eternal I, what mystics call true self or Buddha nature or Atman, this is not dependent on others, is not constructed socially, exists before and after all social contact, and can only be discovered when the false self's dependency is finally broken through prolonged conscious solitude. The false self that needs audience is the prison guard, keeping you locked in performance, in adaptation, in endless seeking of validation that can never satisfy because it's trying to make real something that is fundamentally fictional. Only by withdrawing into solitude, by allowing the false self to starve from lack of social food, by bearing the terror as it dissolves, can you finally discover what remains when everything constructed falls away. The awareness that was always here, witnessing the whole performance, the consciousness that needs no audience because it is itself the eternal witness, complete, whole, free, alone, not in terror but in sovereign self-sufficiency. That is the foundation of genuine connection rather than codependent entanglement. Now we penetrate to the core of the fear, to what actually terrifies you when you face the prospect of genuine aloneness. And Steiner's answer will disturb you precisely because it's true. You're not afraid of being alone with silence. You're afraid of what emerges from that silence when all the distractions finally stop. The voices, the visions, the material from your unconscious that you've spent your entire life running from, the shadow elements you've denied and repressed, the existential questions you've avoided, the pain you've never fully felt, the truth about yourself and your life that you cannot face as long as you keep the noise going. Solitude is not empty. That's the terrifying secret. It's actually full, overwhelmingly full of everything you've pushed into the basement of consciousness, and when you're finally alone, truly alone, the basement door swings open and everything you've been fleeing comes flooding out. And this is what you're actually afraid of. Not the absence of others, but the presence of what you've hidden from yourself. The psychological research on experiential avoidance validates this understanding completely. Studies by Stephen Hayes and others in acceptance and commitment therapy show that attempts to avoid or suppress unwanted internal experiences actually increase their frequency and intensity, creating a vicious cycle where avoidance generates more of what's being avoided. Research on rumination and intrusive thoughts demonstrates that the more you try not to think about something, the more it dominates consciousness, the famous white bear effect where suppression backfires. Studies on trauma and dissociation show that painful experiences that aren't processed consciously don't disappear but get stored in fragmented form, emerging as symptoms, flashbacks, somatic pain, emotional dysregulation. Research on sensory deprivation experiments shows that when external stimulation is removed, internal content rapidly intensifies. People experiencing vivid hallucinations, memories, emotional states within hours, revealing the constant mental activity usually drowned out by external noise. Traditional spiritual teachings recognize this confrontation with internal material as necessary stage on the path. In Buddhist practice, sitting meditation immediately confronts you with what they call monkey mind, the constant chaotic mental activity usually obscured by engagement with external world. In Christian mysticism, the descent into the cell of self-knowledge reveals the demons dwelling within, what Gregory the Great called the battle with interior vices that emerges in solitude. In Hindu Vedanta, the practice of self-inquiry deliberately turns attention inward, confronting all the psychological material, the vasanas or unconscious tendencies, that normally remain hidden. Steiner's description of meeting the lesser guardian of the threshold is a precise map of this encounter. In solitude, you face your own shadow, all the denied, repressed, unintegrated aspects of yourself that you've projected onto others or hidden from awareness, and this meeting is terrifying because it shatters your idealized self-image, reveals what you actually are beneath the persona you've carefully constructed. The signs that you're running from internal material, rather than just preferring company, are distinctive and troubling when you recognize them. You find it literally impossible to sit still and quiet. Within minutes, restlessness becomes unbearable. You must move, do something, check something, the anxiety rising like a physical force compelling you to escape. When you try to meditate or be alone, intrusive thoughts flood in, often disturbing content, memories you'd rather not remember, feelings you'd rather not feel, questions you'd rather not ask. You use substances, food, shopping, sex, work, exercise, anything that changes your internal state or distracts from it, creating dependency on external means of emotional regulation. Your dreams are disturbing, or you don't remember them at all. suggesting unconscious material is either breaking through or being heavily defended against. You notice that being alone triggers specific fears or memories, perhaps childhood experiences of abandonment, punishment, or trauma that you've never fully processed. You develop physical symptoms when forced into isolation, headaches, nausea, panic, as psyche desperately tries to avoid confronting what's inside. The stages of what emerges when you finally stop running and allow yourself to be alone with internal silence follow a predictable pattern that spiritual traditions have mapped for centuries. First comes the surface material, the constant mental chatter, the to-do lists, the replayed conversations, the planning and worrying that usually operates in background. This is relatively benign, but reveals how little control you have over your own mind, how mechanical your thinking actually is. Second layer is emotional content. Suppressed feelings that haven't been fully processed, sadness, anger, fear, shame that you've been avoiding through constant activity. This is more uncomfortable, but still manageable. Third layer is the shadow material. Parts of yourself you've denied, qualities you've judged as unacceptable, impulses you've repressed because they conflict with your self-image. This is where it gets genuinely difficult, confronting aspects of yourself you've disowned. Fourth layer is existential, the big questions you've avoided. What is the point? What happens when I die? Why am I here? What does anything mean? This is where many people panic and flee back to distraction. Fifth layer, if you can bear to go this deep, is the void itself, the groundlessness, the recognition that there is no solid self, no ultimate meaning given from outside, just raw existence that you must confront and somehow make sense of. And understanding what you're running from transforms the entire dynamic, because once you recognize that avoidance is creating the problem, that the monster you're fleeing is actually just your own unlived life, your own unfelt feelings, your own unanswered questions, the strategy shifts from escape to engagement. You stop seeing solitude as threat and start recognizing it as opportunity, the only space where this material can finally surface and be worked with consciously. You develop curiosity about what emerges rather than immediately pushing it away, treating your inner world as territory to be explored rather than enemy to be defeated. You recognize that the anxiety of being alone is actually the energy of repressed material seeking release, and that if you can bear to stay present with it rather than fleeing, it will move through, complete itself, transform. You understand that much of your suffering comes not from the original pain, but from the massive effort required to keep it suppressed, and that allowing it to surface, while temporarily more intense, actually leads to relief and integration. The protocol for facing what emerges in solitude requires courage and cannot be rushed. First, create safe container for the work, ensuring you have support available if material becomes overwhelming, therapist, trusted friend, crisis resources. Second, approach gradually, don't force confrontation with deep material before you've developed capacity to handle it. Start with manageable periods of solitude. Third, practice staying present with whatever arises without immediately reacting, judging, or trying to change it, just witnessing, allowing, accepting. Fourth, journal extensively, writing whatever comes up without censoring, giving voice to material that's been silenced. Fifth, work with somatic practices, yoga, breathwork, body-based therapy, because much of the avoided material is stored in the body and can only be released somatically. Sixth, be patient. This is work of years, not weeks. The unconscious reveals itself at its own pace. Trying to force it creates resistance. We arrive at the recognition that your fear of solitude is actually fear of yourself, of everything you've hidden, denied, repressed, pushed away, and that this fear is entirely valid because what's been hidden is genuinely difficult, painful, disorienting to confront. But here's what Steiner understood and what you must eventually recognize. The material you're running from is not actually as dangerous as your fear of it. The demons in the basement are not as monstrous as the anxiety about opening the door suggests. And most importantly, on the other side of facing what you've been fleeing is not destruction, but liberation, not annihilation, but integration, not death, but rebirth. The terror of silence is the last defense of the ego, the final attempt to keep you from discovering what lies beyond ego's territory. And when you finally stop running, when you finally turn and face what emerges in solitude, when you finally allow the silence to reveal its contents, you discover something extraordinary, that everything you were fleeing was actually seeking you, was trying to return home, was calling for integration, and that in facing it, feeling it, accepting it, you don't die. You become more whole, more complete, more authentically yourself than you've ever been. The silence is not empty, and it's not your enemy. It's full of you, the parts you abandoned, and it's waiting patiently for you to finally stop running and embrace what you've always been, complete with all the light and all the shadow, all the beauty and all the pain, the whole catastrophic, gorgeous truth of being human, conscious, alive, And finally, courageously alone. Now we turn from diagnosis to practice, from understanding why solitude terrifies to learning how isolation can be transformed from punishment into privilege, from loneliness into sacred solitude. And Steiner's teaching here is both practical and profound. There is alchemical process, specific stages and practices through which the raw material of isolation transmutes into spiritual gold, where being alone shifts from desperate avoidance to deliberate cultivation, where solitude becomes not just tolerable but essential, the very ground on which genuine spiritual development occurs. This transformation is not automatic. Most people remain trapped in loneliness their entire lives without ever discovering the doorway to solitude. But for those who learn the alchemical art, being alone becomes their greatest treasure, the space where consciousness deepens, where creativity flows, where the eternal self finally has room to emerge. The research on beneficial solitude provides scientific framework for understanding this transformation. Studies on solitary retreats, particularly research on intensive meditation retreats by Clifford Sarin and others, show measurable improvements in attention, emotional regulation, well-being, immune function, and even telomerase activity, suggesting cellular rejuvenation. Research on creativity consistently demonstrates that breakthrough insights, original thinking, artistic innovation require solitude, time away from social input, where mind can make novel connections. Studies on restoration and nature exposure by Rachel and Stephen Kaplan show that time alone in natural settings produces cognitive renewal, stress reduction, enhanced capacity for directed attention. Research on solitude and adolescent development by Reed Larson shows that teenagers who develop capacity for positive solitude show better adjustment, higher achievement, more mature identity formation than those who avoid alone time. But the traditional spiritual teachings on this transformation go far beyond psychology's understanding. In Buddhist practice, extended solitary retreats of months or years are understood as essential for deep realization, creating conditions where consciousness can penetrate beyond surface patterns into fundamental nature of mind. In Christian mysticism, the desert tradition, monks spending decades in solitary cells, recognize that meeting with God requires radical aloneness, stripping away all intermediaries until only the soul and divine remain. In Hindu traditions, the final stage of life, sannyasa, involves renunciation of social ties to focus entirely on spiritual liberation through solitary practice. In Sufi teaching, the khalwa, or retreat, involves 40 days of intensive solitary practice at specific stages of the path. Steiner's initiation science describes specific exercises requiring daily solitary practice over years, developing capacities that only emerge in isolation from social influence, what he called building the organs of spiritual perception. The signs that loneliness is beginning to transform into solitude are subtle but distinctive, marking passage from suffering to practice. You notice that time alone no longer feels like punishment, but like relief, an opportunity rather than deprivation. The anxiety that used to arise in isolation begins to settle, replaced by calm or even enjoyment of your own company. You start deliberately creating solitude rather than just enduring it when circumstances force it on you, carving out time alone because you value what happens there. Creative ideas, insights, solutions to problems arise more frequently when you're alone than when with others. You feel less need for constant entertainment or stimulation, able to sit quietly without agenda, without needing to fill the space. Your meditation practice deepens, interior silence becoming accessible where before there was only noise. You notice that after being alone, you return to social interaction refreshed rather than depleted, more present, more authentic, less performing. The stages of alchemical transformation from loneliness to solitude follow clear progression that mirrors the classical alchemical operations. The nigredo, or blackening, is the initial descent into isolation, the pain, the grief, the feeling of abandonment that comes when you're first truly alone. This stage cannot be skipped. The suffering must be felt fully, but it's not the destination. It's the beginning. The albedo, or whitening, is the purification, where through sustained time alone you begin to release the false self's demands, the social conditioning, the need for external validation, creating spaciousness where before there was only clutching. The Katrinitas, or yellowing, is the dawning of insight, where solitude begins to reveal its gifts, where you start to discover who you are without others defining you, where interior light begins to shine. The rubedo, or reddening, is the integration, where solitude becomes solitude, where being alone is no longer privation but fullness, where you've discovered the eternal companion within that makes you complete, whether others are present or absent. And this transformation changes everything about your relationship to others as well as to yourself. When you're no longer desperately avoiding solitude, no longer needing constant company, you stop using relationships to fill inner emptiness. Stop demanding that others make you feel complete. Your connections become chosen rather than compulsive. You're with people because you want to be, not because you can't bear to be alone. You develop genuine compassion because you faced your own depths in solitude. You know the territory of suffering and can be present with others' pain without needing to fix it or flee from it. You become more authentic because you've spent time with yourself, know your actual values and desires, are less swayed by social pressure. Paradoxically, learning to be alone makes you better at being together because you bring wholeness rather than neediness, presence rather than performance, truth rather than adaptation. The protocol for cultivating solitude as spiritual practice requires systematic development of capacity most modern people have atrophied. First, start with regular brief periods, even 10 minutes daily of completely solitary practice, sitting, walking, journaling, meditation, no screens, no input, just you and your consciousness. Second, gradually extend duration, working up to hours, half days, eventually full days or longer in solitude. Third, create ritual structure for alone time, signaling to psyche that this is sacred space, perhaps lighting candle, sitting in specific place, using specific opening practice. Fourth, develop specific practices for solitude, whether meditation, contemplation, creative work, study, yoga, prayer, activities that engage consciousness intentionally rather than just passing time. Fifth, periodically undertake intensive retreat, whether formal meditation retreat or simply time alone in nature where you can go deeper than daily practice allows. Sixth, keep journal of what emerges in solitude, tracking insights, patterns, transformations over time. We arrive at the recognition that solitude is not natural state for humans, but is cultivated capacity, skill that must be developed through practice, and that this development is itself spiritual path, way of discovering that you are not the social construct, not the reflected self, not the performer needing audience, but our vast consciousness that exists independently, eternally, completely whole within itself. What Steiner called the birth of the higher self cannot occur in crowd, cannot emerge through social activity, requires the chrysalis of solitude, where the caterpillar of social ego can dissolve and the butterfly of spiritual individuality can finally emerge. This is why all genuine spiritual paths, despite their differences in technique and terminology, converge on this requirement. At some point, you must go alone, must enter the wilderness, must face yourself without intermediary, must discover what you are when everything external is stripped away. The fear of solitude is the guardian at the gate, preventing entry until you're ready. But for those who persist, who develop the alchemical art, who learn to transform loneliness into solitude, what awaits is not the death the fear promised, but is birth, the discovery of your true nature that can only be found in the sacred aloneness where you finally stop performing, stop adapting, stop seeking, and simply are complete, whole, sovereign, eternally alone and eternally all one, the paradox that resolves itself only in the silence you finally learn to embrace. Now we venture into territory that will sound like mystical fantasy until you experience it directly. That genuine solitude, sustained conscious aloneness, opens doorways to encounters with presences, beings, intelligences that cannot manifest while you're immersed in social noise and external distraction, what Steiner called spiritual beings from higher hierarchies, who can only make contact when you've created sufficient inner silence and solitude to perceive dimensions beyond physical. Reality. This is not imagination or hallucination, but is one of the primary reasons why spiritual traditions insist on solitary practice, why mystics retreat into wilderness, why initiates enter extended isolation. Because certain teachings, certain initiations, certain forms of knowledge can only be transmitted in solitude, directly from spiritual teacher to solitary student, in the empty space that becomes full of presences invisible to ordinary perception once you've learned to see with inner vision, rather than physical eyes. The scientific framework closest to validating these experiences comes from research on altered states of consciousness. Studies on sensory deprivation by researchers like John Lilly documented experiences of encountering apparently autonomous entities, intelligences, presences during extended isolation. Research on meditation and mystical experience by Roland Griffiths and others shows that extended contemplative practice, typically done in solitude, produces encounters that practitioners describe as meetings with divine, with guides, with teachers of profound wisdom, experiences that share phenomenological features with spontaneous mystical experiences but are more reliably accessible through deliberate practice. Studies on near-death experiences consistently report encounters with beings of light, deceased relatives, spiritual guides, suggesting that consciousness has capacity for perception beyond physical senses when conditions are right. Research on lucid dreaming and hypnagogia shows that consciousness naturally generates encounters with apparently autonomous others in certain states, raising questions about the nature and source of these presences. Traditional teachings across cultures describe the guides, teachers, and beings that appear in solitude with remarkable consistency, despite different cultural frameworks. In Buddhism, Dakinis and Dharmapalas, fierce protector deities and wisdom teachers, appear as solitary practitioners, offering teachings and tests. In Christian mysticism, desert fathers reported encounters with angels and demons, divine visions and diabolic temptations, understanding that spiritual beings of all kinds become perceptible in the desert silence. In shamanic traditions worldwide, extended vision quests in solitary wilderness produce meetings with power animals, ancestral spirits, teacher beings, who provide guidance, healing, and initiation. In Sufism, the relationship with the invisible guide, or kidder, who appears to teach the solitary seeker, is central to the path. Steiner's detailed descriptions of the spiritual hierarchies, angels, archangels, archai, and higher beings, include specific teaching that these beings can only truly be perceived when consciousness is refined through solitary spiritual practice, their presence obscured by the coarse vibrations of ordinary social reality. The signs that you're beginning to encounter presences in solitude are distinctive and should be approached with both openness and discernment. You sense a presence in the room when you're alone, not frightening but palpable, as if someone is there with you though you see no one physically. You hear an interior voice that's distinct from your usual mental chatter, speaking with authority, wisdom, or knowledge that doesn't feel like it's coming from your personal mind. You experience spontaneous visions, images, or symbols appearing in meditation or contemplation that feel meaningful, archetypal, laden with significance you can't fully articulate. You meet teachers, guides, or beings in dreams who provide specific instruction, and these dream figures have quality of reality different from ordinary dream characters. You feel guided, as if invisible hand is orchestrating circumstances, providing exactly what you need at exact right moment, synchronicities that suggest intelligence operating beyond your conscious awareness. You notice that insights, creative inspirations, solutions to problems come to you in solitude in ways that feel like they're being transmitted or taught rather than thought up by your mind. The developmental stages of learning to work with these presences in solitude progress from random encounters to deliberate relationship. First stage is simply recognizing that something is happening, that solitude is producing experiences beyond ordinary consciousness, that you're not just alone but are in presence of something. Second stage is developing discernment, learning to distinguish between your own psychological projections, the autonomous complexes of your psyche, and genuine contact with beings beyond your individual consciousness. This requires honesty, humility, and preferably guidance from someone who has navigated this territory. Third stage is establishing communication, learning the language these presences use, whether symbolic imagery, intuitive knowing, bodily sensation, synchronistic signs, dreams, and learning to receive their teaching. Fourth stage is developing relationship, regular practice that invites and maintains contact, whether through prayer, meditation, ritual, or other means, treating this relationship as real, consequential, requiring respect and reciprocity. Fifth stage is integration, taking what's received and embodying it, living the teachings, recognizing that these encounters serve your development, your work in the world, not just your personal fascination, and understanding that solitude opens these doors, transforms it from mere absence of others into sacred space, temple, laboratory where you meet with teachers who cannot manifest in the noise and distraction of ordinary social life. Some of these encounters are nourishing, supportive, what traditions call angels or guides or benevolent ancestors who genuinely aid your development. Some are challenging, testing, what traditions call demons or tricksters or adversarial forces whose function is to strengthen you through resistance. Some are neutral, simply beings existing in dimensions adjacent to physical reality that become perceptible when your consciousness attunes to their frequency. Learning to navigate this territory requires development of what Steiner called spiritual scientific thinking, approaching these experiences with both openness to genuine spiritual reality and critical discernment that prevents delusion, inflation, or possession. The protocol for working safely and effectively with presences encountered in solitude requires preparation and protection. First, establish strong foundation and grounding practices. Physical yoga, martial arts, gardening, cooking, activities that keep you connected to body and earth, because work with subtle beings can produce dissociation if you're not grounded. Second, develop clear intention about why you're seeking this contact, what you hope to learn or receive, ensuring motivation is service rather than power, growth rather than escape. Third, create ritual structure for encounters, specific time, place, opening and closing practices that establish boundaries, signal when you're available for contact and when you're not. Fourth, practice discernment by evaluating guidance received. Does it elevate consciousness or inflate ego? Does it increase love and compassion or judgment and superiority? Does it encourage integration with life or escape from it? Fifth, find teacher or community that acknowledges and works with these dimensions, because attempting this alone is difficult and potentially dangerous. Sixth, honor the presences with respect but not worship, recognizing them as helpers on your path, not as authorities to be obeyed blindly. We arrive at the profound recognition that solitude is never actually empty, that in the space you create by withdrawing from human company, other forms of company become available, and that the greatest teachers, the wisest guides, the most profound forms of knowledge often come not through books or human teachers, but through direct contact with spiritual beings who can only manifest when you've created sufficient silence, sufficient receptivity, sufficient solitude to receive their presence. What Steiner called spiritual science, the systematic investigation of supersensible realities, requires exactly this capacity: to be alone without being lonely, to be in solitude without being isolated, to withdraw from human society, not as escape, but as deliberate choice, to make yourself available for teachings and encounters that only occur in the empty space that you've learned is actually full, teeming with presences, alive with intelligences, vibrating with teachings waiting to be received by those courageous enough to face the solitude, patient enough to wait in the silence, open enough to perceive what ordinary perception cannot see. The fear of solitude keeps you from these encounters, keeps you trapped in the human-only dimension, prevents you from discovering that you are never truly alone, that you are always surrounded by presences, always supported by guides, always in contact with intelligences who are serving your evolution, if only you would create the space, the silence, the sacred solitude where they can finally make themselves known. Now we arrive at perhaps the most practical and most revolutionary teaching about solitude, that it is the forge where genuine self-sovereignty is built, where you develop the capacity to stand alone, to determine your own values, to validate your own experience, to be your own authority, what Steiner called the development of the true I, the eternal spiritual individuality that is not dependent on others' opinions, not swayed by collective pressures, not requiring external validation to know its own worth and direction. This is not isolation as defense against others, not arrogance or superiority, but is the mature capacity to be with yourself, to trust yourself, to guide yourself, which paradoxically is the foundation of genuine connection with others, because you come from wholeness rather than neediness, from center rather than desperate seeking of center through another. The developmental psychology research on autonomy and self-determination by researchers like Edward Desai and Richard Ryan shows that autonomy, the experience of being self-governing, is one of three fundamental psychological needs along with competence and relatedness, and that autonomy requires capacity for independent thought and action that must be developed through experience. Studies on individuation by Jungian analysts show that becoming psychological individual, differentiating from collective conditioning, requires intensive inner work that necessarily occurs in solitude. Research on locus of control demonstrates that people with internal locus, belief that they control their outcomes through their own actions, show better mental health, achievement, and resilience than those with external locus who believe outcomes are determined by outside forces. Studies on self-authoring by developmental psychologists like Robert Kegan show that moving from socialized mind, where values come from others, to self-authoring mind, where you determine your own values, is crucial developmental transition that many adults never achieve. Traditional wisdom teachings recognize self-sovereignty as essential spiritual achievement. In Buddhism, taking refuge in yourself, becoming your own lamp, as Buddha taught in his final words, means developing capacity to validate your own experience through direct perception, rather than relying on authority. In Stoic philosophy, the sage is one who remains unmoved by external circumstances, deriving peace and purpose from internal virtue rather than external validation or fortune. In Taoist teaching, the sage lives according to inner nature rather than social convention, exemplifying wu-wei or effortless action arising from alignment with Tao rather than ego striving for approval. Steiner's path of initiation explicitly aims at developing what he called moral intuition, capacity to perceive right action directly through spiritual perception, rather than following rules or social norms, recognizing that spiritual maturity means taking full responsibility for your choices, rather than deferring to external authority. The signs that you're developing genuine sovereignty through solitude, rather than just becoming isolated or defensive, are crucial to recognize. You find yourself less reactive to others' opinions, able to hear criticism or praise without being destabilized by either. You make decisions based on inner knowing rather than consensus, able to stand by unpopular choices when you know they're right. You feel comfortable being different, having unconventional views or lifestyle, not needing everyone to approve or understand. You validate your own experience rather than constantly checking whether others see it the same way. You take responsibility for your life, recognizing that you create your experience through your choices rather than blaming others or circumstances. You develop internal moral compass, knowing right from wrong through direct perception rather than just following rules. You become comfortable with uncertainty, able to not know without anxiety, trusting that you can navigate whatever arises. The stages of building sovereignty and solitude follow progression from dependence to independence to interdependence. First stage is recognizing your current dependency, seeing how much your sense of self, your decisions, your emotions are determined by others rather than arising from your own center. Second stage is deliberate withdrawal, using solitude to create space from social influence where you can begin to hear your own voice beneath the chorus of internalized others. Third stage is experimentation, trying out values, perspectives, choices that are genuinely yours rather than adopted from others, discovering what you actually think and want when social pressure is removed. Fourth stage is consolidation, where through repeated experience in solitude, you develop stable internal reference point, core sense of self that doesn't require constant external validation. Fifth stage is mature interdependence, where you can fully engage with others while maintaining your center, neither losing yourself in relationship nor defending against genuine connection, able to be influenced without being controlled, able to be intimate without being merged. And this sovereignty transforms every aspect of existence, creating foundation for spiritual development that remains impossible as long as you're psychologically dependent on others. When you can stand alone, you're no longer manipulable through fear of rejection or desire for approval, freeing you from the primary mechanisms of social control. When you validate your own experience, you can trust your direct spiritual perception rather than requiring authorities to tell you what's real or true. When you take responsibility for your life, you step into genuine power rather than remaining victim of circumstances. When you develop internal moral compass, you can make ethical choices in ambiguous situations where rules don't clearly apply. Most importantly, when you've built fortress of self in solitude, you discover that this fortress has no walls, that genuine sovereignty is not isolation, but is capacity to be fully present with others without losing yourself, to love without attaching, to commit without subordinating, to connect without codepending. The protocol for developing sovereignty through solitude requires systematic practice over extended time. First, identify areas where you're still dependent on others' validation, where you can't act without approval, where you change yourself to fit their expectations, making these conscious targets for development. Second, practice making small decisions autonomously, not consulting anyone, just acting from your own judgment, building muscle of self-trust. Third, spend extended time alone, weeks or months if possible, long enough that you're forced to develop internal resources rather than relying on external support. Fourth, develop practices that strengthen internal sense of self, meditation, journaling, creative work, physical challenges, anything that requires you to rely on yourself rather than others. Fifth, examine your values explicitly, asking which ones are genuinely yours versus which you've absorbed unquestioningly from family, culture, religion, sorting through and consciously choosing what you actually believe. Sixth, practice dissent, taking positions you actually hold even when they're unpopular, learning to bear others' disapproval without collapsing. We arrive at the recognition that genuine sovereignty, the capacity to stand alone, to be your own authority, to live from your own center, is not achieved through social success or accumulation of power, but is built in the solitude, where all external supports are removed and you're forced to discover what you actually are when everything else is stripped away. This is why Steiner taught that the path of initiation necessarily involves what he called treading the path in utter solitude, recognizing that no one can give you your sovereignty. It cannot be granted by authority or achieved through relationship. It can only be discovered by going alone into the wilderness of yourself and remaining there long enough to find the eternal I that needs no one and nothing to validate its existence, because it simply is, has always been, will always be, the unchanging witness of all changing phenomena, the sovereign consciousness that is simultaneously alone and all one, isolated and universal, individual and cosmic, the paradox that resolves itself only when you've built the fortress of self so completely that you discover it's not a fortress at all, but is the open sky, the vast space, the infinite awareness that contains everything and is bound by nothing, free precisely because it needs nothing external to be complete, sovereign precisely. Because it has discovered that what it is cannot be given or taken away, threatened or validated by any force outside itself. This is the fortress that solitude builds, and it is simultaneously impregnable and transparent, absolute protection and total openness, the foundation from which genuine spiritual work becomes possible. Because you're no longer seeking, no longer needing, no longer dependent, just here, complete, sovereign, awake. Now we arrive at the paradox that will invert your understanding of both solitude and connection. That only those who have learned to be genuinely alone can truly connect with others, that only those who don't need relationship can have healthy relationships, that the capacity for solitude is actually the foundation of genuine love rather than its opposite. Steiner recognized what remains invisible to conventional understanding, that what most people call love is actually codependency, need, attachment, projection, two incomplete people clinging to each other hoping the other will fill their emptiness, and that real love, the kind that liberates rather than binds, that elevates rather than diminishes, only becomes possible when you've faced your solitude completely, discovered your own wholeness, and can therefore meet another from fullness rather than neediness, from choice rather than desperation, from strength rather than weakness. The psychological research on attachment and relationships validates this understanding from multiple angles. Studies by John Bowlby on attachment theory show that securely attached individuals can be both close and autonomous, able to maintain intimate relationships while retaining independent identity, while anxiously attached people become clingy and avoidantly attached people remain distant, both patterns revealing inability to balance connection and solitude. Research on differentiation by Murray Bowen demonstrates that people with poorly differentiated selves lose their boundaries in close relationships, becoming either fused with others or rigidly defended against intimacy, while highly differentiated people can be intimate while maintaining clear sense of self. Studies on loneliness by Cacioppo show that chronic loneliness actually impairs ability to connect, creating hypervigilance and social anxiety that prevents the very connection being sought, while those comfortable with solitude show better social functioning, higher quality relationships. Traditional wisdom teachings recognize this paradox explicitly. In Zen Buddhism, the teaching that to love someone means letting them be free, not possessing or controlling them, requires that you be free yourself, which means not needing them to complete you. In Christian mysticism, the mystic who has found union with divine can then love others with agape, unconditional love that seeks nothing for itself, possible only because their primary relationship is with God rather than with human others. In Sufi poetry, particularly Rumi, the teaching that lovers don't finally meet somewhere, they're in each other all along, points to recognition that genuine meeting requires you to first meet yourself, to discover that what you are is not separate from what others are at deepest level. Steiner taught that true community requires individuated members, that collective consciousness only becomes conscious when individuals wake up, that genuine connection happens between sovereign beings, not between dependent fragments seeking completion through each other. The signs that your relationships are based on need rather than love, on inability to be alone rather than capacity for genuine connection, are everywhere in modern relational patterns if you look honestly. You feel anxious or lost when partner is unavailable, unable to self-regulate without their presence. You compromise your own values or interests to maintain the relationship, losing yourself in the other. You need constant reassurance, validation, contact, interpreting normal distance as rejection or abandonment. You have no clear sense of where you end and they begin, taking on their emotions, problems, responsibilities as if they were your own. You remain in relationships that aren't working because being alone feels worse than staying in dysfunction. You move from relationship to relationship, unable to tolerate gaps of solitude, using new partner to avoid facing yourself. You love not the actual person, but the image of them, the role they play, what they do for your sense of self, which is not love at all, but use. The developmental progression from dependent relationships to genuine love follows clear stages. First stage is recognizing dependency, seeing how much you need others to feel okay, how much relationship is driven by avoiding solitude rather than celebrating connection. Second stage is choosing solitude deliberately, ending relationships, or taking breaks, not because they're bad, but because you need to discover who you are without them. Third stage is doing the work of solitude, facing yourself, developing your own wholeness, discovering that you can be complete alone. Fourth stage is recognizing that you don't need anyone, which paradoxically opens possibility of genuine connection, because now you can choose relationship from want rather than need, from fullness rather than emptiness. Fifth stage is mature love, meeting another sovereign being, two wholenesses choosing to share rather than two halves, desperately seeking completion, love that enhances rather than completes, that celebrates rather than clings, that liberates rather than possesses. And this recognition transforms everything about how you approach relationship, shifting from scarcity to abundance, from grasping to offering, from using to serving. When you don't need others to complete you, you stop demanding they be other than they are, stop trying to change or fix or control them. When you've faced your own depths in solitude, you can be present with their depths without fear or judgment. When you know yourself, you can see them clearly rather than projecting your needs and fears onto them. When you're comfortable alone, you can give them space without interpreting it as abandonment. When you're whole in yourself, you can handle relationships' inevitable challenges without catastrophizing or fleeing. Paradoxically, learning to be alone makes you better at being together because you bring presence rather than neediness, truth rather than performance, love rather than transaction. The protocol for developing capacity for both solitude and connection requires consciously working with both poles. First, if you're currently in a relationship, negotiate periods of deliberate solitude, time apart not as punishment or avoidance, but as practice, discovering what it's like to be with yourself. Second, if you're between relationships, resist impulse to immediately seek new one, using this time to develop genuine relationship with yourself. Third, examine your relational patterns honestly, identifying where you've been dependent, where you've lost yourself, where you've used others to avoid your own inner work. Fourth, develop capacity to self-soothe, to regulate your emotions, to meet your needs without requiring another person to do it for you. Fifth, practice vulnerability without attachment, being honest, open, intimate, while maintaining your center, not losing yourself in the sharing. Sixth, choose relationships consciously, recognizing that you're choosing because you want to share your life, not because you need someone to complete it. We arrive at the liberating recognition that solitude and connection are not opposites, but are complementary poles. That genuine love requires both, that the depth of your capacity for connection is determined by the depth of your capacity for solitude, and vice versa. You cannot truly meet another if you've never met yourself. You cannot give what you don't have. You cannot love freely if you're enslaved by need. This is why Steiner insisted that spiritual development must balance inner work and solitude with outer work and community, that the hermit and the social reformer are both incomplete, that genuine maturity requires capacity for both profound solitude and profound connection. The fear of solitude keeps you trapped in dependent relationships, using others as shields against your own emptiness, never discovering the paradoxical truth that only when you can stand completely alone can you truly stand with another, that only when you're complete in yourself can you genuinely share yourself, that only when you don't need love can you actually give love, the kind of love that doesn't grasp or cling or demand, the kind that celebrates the other's freedom because you know your own, the kind that meets not out of desperation but out of recognition, seeing in the other's eyes the same eternal consciousness that gazes out from yours, alone and all one, separate and united. The paradox that resolves itself in the embrace of two sovereign beings who chose each other not because they had to, but because they wanted to, not to fill emptiness, but to share fullness, not to escape solitude, but to celebrate the extraordinary gift of momentarily bridging it, knowing that beneath all connection and all separation there is only the one consciousness, loving itself through every encounter, discovering itself through every meeting, awakening to itself through the dance of solitude and connection that makes existence the grand adventure it is. Now we enter the darkest teaching, the one that requires you to face what you most desperately want to avoid. That certain stages of spiritual development require not chosen solitude, but forced isolation, not comfortable alone time, but devastating abandonment, experiences where everyone leaves, where every support collapses, where you're left utterly alone, not because you sought solitude, but because life, karma, or divine will has stripped everything away, and Steiner recognized these. Abandonment experiences as genuine initiations, necessary stages on the path where you're forced to discover whether you can survive without any external support, whether anything real remains when everything you depended on dissolves. This is the crucifixion stage, the dark night, the descent into hell that precedes resurrection, and while no one volunteers for it, those who survive it emerge transformed in ways that voluntary solitude practice alone could never achieve. The trauma and loss research documents the devastation of abandonment experiences while rarely acknowledging their potential initiatory function. Studies on grief show that profound loss can shatter sense of self, disrupt identity, create disorientation where nothing makes sense anymore, what researchers call complicated grief or prolonged grief disorder. Research on relationship dissolution, particularly divorce after long marriages, shows similar identity fragmentation, people losing their sense of who they are when the relationship that defined them ends. Studies on social exclusion and rejection show activation of physical pain centers in brain, demonstrating that abandonment literally hurts. Research on compound losses, where multiple significant relationships end around same time, shows amplified effects, people experiencing complete collapse of their social world. What research treats as pathology requiring treatment, initiatory traditions recognize as potentially sacred crisis, the breaking that makes transformation possible. Traditional teachings across cultures describe this forced abandonment as necessary stage. In Christian mysticism, The dark night of the soul, particularly as described by John of the Cross, involves God withdrawing all consolation, all sense of presence, leaving the soul in absolute abandonment, feeling forsaken even by divine. And this abandonment is understood not as punishment, but as final purification before union. In Buddha's story, the moment under the Bodhi tree comes after his companions have abandoned him, leaving him alone to face Mara and achieve enlightenment. In shamanic initiation worldwide, the candidate is often left alone to die symbolically, abandoned by their community, returning only if they survive the ordeal. In Steiner's initiation science, there are stages where the student must walk alone without guidance, where even their spiritual teacher cannot accompany them, where they must face the abyss with no hand to hold, no voice to reassure. The signs that you're undergoing abandonment initiation, rather than just experiencing painful loss, are the extremity and timing of what's happening. Multiple significant relationships end around the same time in ways that feel coordinated, as if some intelligence is systematically removing your supports. The losses feel disproportionate, more than normal bad luck, as if you're being deliberately stripped of everything you've depended on. People who you thought would never leave you abandon you, not necessarily because you did something wrong, but as if they're playing roles in a larger script. The timing coincides with other life transitions or crises, compounding the isolation, as if you're being forced into a corner with no escape but through. You find yourself literally alone, without the usual support systems, forced to face yourself and your situation without the distractions you usually rely on. And beneath the pain, if you're honest, there's sense that something is happening, that this is somehow meant to be, that you're in some kind of ordeal that has purpose, even if you can't see it. The stages of moving through abandonment initiation follow brutal but ultimately transformative arc. First stage is the shock and denial, the moment when you realize everyone has left, and you cannot believe it, cannot accept it, keep expecting them to return. Second stage is the rage and grief, the howling pain of abandonment, the fury at those who left, at God, at fate, at yourself, the mourning for what's been lost. Third stage is the descent, where you fall into the abyss, into depression, despair, sometimes even suicidal ideation, feeling like you cannot survive this, that it's too much. Fourth stage is the hitting bottom, the moment of absolute surrender, where you stop fighting, stop hoping for rescue, accept completely that you're alone and must find a way through or die. Fifth stage is the discovery, where in the depths of abandonment you find something unexpected, a strength, a presence, a knowing that wasn't accessible before, the eternal self that remains when everything else is stripped away. Sixth stage is the resurrection, emerging from the ordeal, not just surviving, but transformed, carrying a power and knowing that only abandonment could forge. And those who survive abandonment initiation are recognizable by what they've gained through the ordeal. They have a solidity, a groundedness, a centeredness that people who've never been truly alone never develop, because they discovered they could survive the unsurvivable. They have compassion without sentimentality, able to be present with others' suffering because they've walked through their own hell and know the territory. They have self-sufficiency, not as defense, but as genuine capacity, able to meet their own needs, regulate their own emotions, validate their own experience. They have humility combined with quiet confidence, knowing their limitations but also knowing their strength, having been tested in ways few people are. They have decreased attachment, able to hold relationships lightly because they know loss is inevitable, nothing is permanent, and they can survive it. Most importantly, they have direct relationship with something eternal, having discovered in absolute abandonment that they were never actually alone, that beneath all human connection, there's connection to something vast that cannot abandon them because it's what they are. The protocol for navigating abandonment initiation when it comes, because you cannot really prepare for it, only respond when it arrives. First, accept what's happening rather than fighting reality, recognizing that resistance increases suffering, while acceptance creates space for transformation. Second, feel everything, don't numb or distract, and let yourself be broken by the grief, the rage, the despair, because trying to protect yourself from the pain actually prolongs it. Third, reach out for support from whatever sources remain or are available, therapist, support groups, crisis services, because this is not work to do completely alone, even though it feels that way. Fourth, maintain basic self-care even when you don't want to, eating, sleeping, moving, because your body must survive for the initiation to complete. Fifth, create meaning from the experience, not premature spiritual bypass, but genuine inquiry into what this is teaching you, what you're discovering about yourself and existence through this ordeal. Sixth, document the process, journaling or recording the descent and emergence, because this becomes your testimony, your proof that transformation is possible. We arrive at the teaching that will either devastate or liberate depending on where you are in your journey. That abandonment, the forced solitude that comes not from choice but from loss, is one of the most powerful initiations available in human experience, and that those who've been truly abandoned and survived carry a treasure that cannot be obtained any other way. The direct knowing that you are not what can be abandoned, because what you essentially are is not dependent on anyone or anything for its existence. When everyone leaves and you remain, when all supports collapse and you're still standing, when absolute isolation reveals not annihilation but essential, indestructible self, you discover what mystics have tried to communicate, but which cannot be truly understood until lived, that you are not your relationships, not your roles, not your social identity, but are consciousness itself, eternal and alone, all one, the witness that remains when everything witnessed disappears. This is brutal teaching, unnecessary for some, unavoidable for others, but for those who must walk this path, who find themselves stripped of everyone and everything, there is this consolation, that on the other side of the abandonment, if you survive the crucifixion, what awaits is not just return to normal life, but is resurrection, the birth of consciousness that has died to everything external and discovered itself as what it always was, what it could never not be, alone precisely because it is all complete precisely because it needs nothing, eternal precisely because it was never born and can never die, the indestructible essence that abandonment reveals by taking away everything else, leaving only what's real, what's true, what remains when everything else is gone. Now we shift from the crisis of abandonment to the practice of deliberate solitary work, recognizing that solitude is not just something that happens to you or that you endure, but is actually a laboratory where specific experiments in consciousness can be conducted, practices that only work in isolation because they require a level of attention, consistency, and freedom from social influence that's impossible to maintain in company of others. Steiner's entire path of inner development is essentially laboratory manual, series of exercises designed to be practiced in solitude over years, systematically developing capacities for spiritual perception, moral intuition, and conscious action that remain dormant in ordinary social consciousness. This is practical spirituality, not philosophy or belief, but actual work with consciousness itself, experiments you conduct on yourself to discover what you're capable of becoming. The neuroscience and psychology of deliberate practice provides framework for understanding how solitary work transforms consciousness. Research by Anders Ericsson on expertise shows that development of mastery in any domain requires thousands of hours of deliberate, focused practice, typically done alone, not just repetition, but conscious attention to improvement. Studies on attention and mindfulness by researchers like Amishi Jha show that systematic meditation practice, almost always solitary, produces measurable changes in attentional control, emotional regulation, even brain structure. Research on creativity demonstrates that breakthrough innovations require extended periods of solitary focused work, what psychologists call flow states, that are disrupted by social interaction. Studies on habit formation show that establishing new patterns requires consistent practice in controlled conditions before they become automatic, suggesting that fundamental changes in consciousness require sustained solitary work before they can be maintained in social contexts. Traditional spiritual paths are essentially graduate programs in consciousness, requiring intensive solitary practice over years or decades. In Buddhist meditation traditions, practitioners spend hours daily in formal practice, with periodic intensive retreats of weeks or months in silence, systematically training attention, developing insight, cultivating compassion. In Christian contemplative traditions, monks and nuns maintain daily prayer schedule, lectio divina, contemplation, often including years in solitary hermitage for advanced practitioners. In yoga traditions, the serious practitioner maintains daily sadhana, personal practice, including asana, pranayama, meditation, mantra, typically done in early morning solitude. In Sufi orders, murids follow prescribed practices including dhikr, remembrance of divine, prayer vigils, often in solitary seclusion. Steiner's anthroposophical path involves 6 basic exercises practiced daily in solitude: control of thinking, control of will, equanimity, positivity, open-mindedness, and inner balance, each systematically developing specific soul capacities. The signs that your solitary practice is actually working, producing genuine transformation, rather than just being time alone, are subtle but recognizable. You notice changes in your default consciousness, more present, more aware, less reactive, changes that persist even when you're not practicing. Your capacity for sustained attention increases, able to focus for longer periods without distraction. Your emotional life becomes more stable, less thrown by circumstances, maintaining equanimity through difficulties. You develop capacities that seem almost supernatural, synchronicities increasing, intuition sharpening, sometimes even perceptions that go beyond ordinary senses. Your values and priorities shift, things that seemed important lose their grip, while what's essential becomes clear. Most importantly, you recognize yourself changing. not through effort or forcing, but through the natural unfolding that consistent practice catalyzes, like plant growing toward light, consciousness growing toward its own full potential.